Means you have to click again. All right, hi. So today, hi folks, it's 19th of October. This is Mass Media and Culture. And today we're going to talk about mass media, or the introduction of photography to the mass media. Okay, and the reading today was Ariella Azoulay's essay, Civil Uses of Photography, from her amazing book, Civil Imagination, Political Ontology and Photography. Came out in Israel, I think, in 2010, but was re-released and 5 years later or so. In this lecture, I want to explore concepts of representation, figurative and parliamentary, try and make that distinction. Remind me, ask me if I omit that, and look through the lens of photography, in a way, to the interpretive frame of photography to analyze mass media. And what mass media does with photography, what photography does for mass media, and so on. Thinking of the photo shoot scene, I might show a bit from Antonioni's great film Blow Up, but I watched it again last night, and wondering how I could condense such a great film into a few snippets for a lecture without destroying the art of the film. And I decided I can't really. It hasn't really aged that well. It really looks like a film of its time, but then a film of its time is interesting. It was a huge hit in the 60s. 1966, it came out, captured quite a lot of swinging London, I suppose, but in a very ironic or jaundiced way, perhaps. Yeah, it has wonderful stuff about the technology of making images and mass media and images. Yeah, but I want to go back a little bit, as I've done several times, to think about how mass media has been impacted by photography. That means thinking about how long it took, I guess, for the world to absorb the transformation of knowledge and the way we see things that photography has brought to us. I mean, it already took a long time for the world to understand the printing press, right? We've gone over that previously. And then the question is whether we've even yet understood the implications of what that did to our minds, remapping our ways of understanding knowledge. And then photography. And then after photography, which is 150 years ago, how that changed our possibilities of perception. And so did film, and so did television, and then putting the camera in your pocket, and then having the internet in your pocket, and all-day interconnectivity. How these things change our concept of knowledge, what is true and what is not true. It's going to take some time. I don't think we even understand yet how mass reproduction of print, the basis of newspapers, transformed society. Not just individuals, but society. I mean, we've discussed this already in the course. Nationalism, and the creation of a people, the following of leaders, these factors were changed. Now, photography also brings some change in the way we can see the world and know the world and understand the world. I mean, for starters, we can snap versions of the world. But the question, big question, is what's the status of those versions of the world? So a French theorist called Michel Foucault, I've talked about him in other courses, a teacher of Jacques Derrida, at the middle of the 60s, beginning of the 60s, he wrote amazing book on the history of reason, but was really a history of madness. It was called both A History of Reason and A History of Madness, looking at the ways in which society had excluded those it considered insane, first as fools and then as sick individuals, and then contained them in asylums and so on, and what a model for the institution that became. But then subsequently in the mid-60s, at the same time as the film Blow Up, he produced a book called The Order of Things. Maybe, having reread that as well in preparation this week, I think maybe it's one of his more difficult works. So I've not put it as reading for you, but I recommend that you do read it. Great stuff about Don Quixote in there and stuff. But economics, finance, and semiotics are the themes of that book. Order of Things, or Words and Things in French, mots et choses, is the text. And he goes there into thinking a lot about, he argues that in the 16th century, the dominant frame through which the world was understood was resemblance, or representation of things as they are. So similarities were found between so many different things. It's almost like the metaphoric idea of resemblance was our way of understanding. And it's interesting to think in his later work with photography, a book called This Is Not a Pipe, on Magritte's paintings, but thinking about photography a lot. The idea of the representation of the world that a photograph takes is challenged. Now, to understand that whole debate, we need to know about the art movements that were shaping discussion in France. Impressionism, Cubism, abstraction, surrealism, how progressive series of art innovations or movements were shifting away from direct representation of the world as is, like landscape or portraiture, landscape, pictorial representations of the landscape as it was, or its ideal form as it could be imagined. That was coming as a change, and representations of the person as a kind of portrait that summed them up. So it was a resemblance of the person, but it was a representation of them in their essence in a portrait. And a photograph was, early on, maybe not so far from that, but for a long period became a record of that. And still, to a degree, we think of a photograph as a record of that person. Now, you all have student cards with a photograph of yourself on them, right? But the problem that Foucault starts to address, and we need to think about this in relation to the movement of art towards abstraction, is the loss of index locality, all right? Now, a photograph of yourself on your student card is an index of you, in a sense. It's a photograph that is supposed to represent you, but it's very small, right? But it, even though it's so small, it refers to a full-size person. That's the index, right? And even though it's a snapshot in time, it refers to a time when you really were standing in front of the camera. And so it really is you. Although, of course, now someone with good Photoshop skills, someone with very good photographic Photoshop skills would be able to change, right? But of course we shouldn't. We kind of, our passport photo, our staff card photo, our student photo have to be following a certain protocol so that they are an accurate representation within certain assumptions, right? That it be very small, that it be very flat, that it be set in one instant of time. And of course, we're always changing. And a selfie is like that too. We believe selfies are how we are at a certain moment. Now, if we thought about this history of Impressionism, Cubism, Abstraction, Surrealism, to think through this, we'd recognize that slowly, we might recognize that slowly the connection between what is represented in art or in other forms of representation is separating from the real. Okay, and then we have the explosion, Walter Benjamin's phrase, the explosion of 28 frames per second of film. So film changes again how we can think about representation. Time-based media is somehow different to the photographic snapshot. So we take film as more documentary, although it can be completely fiction too, right? So what I'm pointing to here that we have to come to grips with in terms of the changes that this means for society is that there's been a slow disconnection from indexicality. The representation of the world as it is has been through this phased change, so that a painting was of the real, and then the painting sort of exploded into being abstract. Well, went through so many stages, right? Impression, then cuboid and pointillism, and so on and so forth. And now, so also the photograph, when the photograph and the film were documentary for a period, and now, especially with digitization, indexicality has been broken, so that the negative to the photograph, which is very much a focus of the film Blow Up, the negative to the photograph isn't the only guarantor of access to the real. So after Foucault's work on representation, especially in his book History of Sexuality, Volume 1, that's focused, pun intended, upon the ways in sex was repressed but made to talk about itself. There is a discourse about photography that seems to almost overwhelm what exists in photography, all right? And this is the discourse of the gaze in photography. So it's a commentary on photographs that at one stage became so huge that it was overwhelming what was actually being photographed. So people, and I think that's true a bit for film as well. So sometimes the discourse of what was happening in the material was overwhelming the material in a sense. So Foucault writes this book on sex, history of sexuality, but it's really like psychoanalysis. And sex was repressed in Victorian times, he says. You couldn't really talk about it at the very same time as you were made to talk about it all the time, to confess it in church, to talk to it to your therapist, to your psychoanalyst. Psychoanalysis was obsessed with it, and everyone was obsessed with sex. Even children were, in psychoanalysis, were in love with their parents and so on. I mean, the unconscious and all of that was made to express itself, the hidden reality, if you like. And this was also, in a way, there's a parallel, a resemblance with the way in which Foucault gets us to think, well, not just Foucault, commentators following him as well, get us to think about how photography is the lens pointing at something, all right? And with this kind of camera, with its lens that projects out, it's more evident that you're pointing than with this flat surface that is the surface of the image in a way, pointing at someone, right? So with this machine, it's not so obvious that you're making a flat surface. You're pushing out into the world with this projection. And yeah, if you're thinking about sex, there's phallic aspects to that as well. And with this kind of camera, we're not reminded of that. And we're not even reminded anymore of the all-seeing eye of the camera, which is one lens. We now got some kind of multi-eyed cyclops. I don't know if you remember the monster in the film Monsters, Inc., the animated cartoon that had many, many eyes. Great image. But the idea here in the discussion about photography that was in journals like Screen and After Image and went on into visual culture and into other disciplines as well, including anthropology, as we'll see. The gaze, and especially in film studies, the male gaze was become a dominant discussion. And what is the male gaze? The male gaze, of course, is looking and objectifying women's bodies. Right? The male gaze in photography was the photograph that photographed women in a certain way as objects and to be consumed, sexual objects, as aesthetic objects, as beauty, right? Not with an autonomy of their own, but as something to be consumed by the observer, which is assumed to be, in these photographs, the close-up of a movie star and so on, usually male. And that's true in cinema as well. There's so much of cinema with the movie star, the screen siren, so many words for the starlets that are on screen to attract and satisfy the male gaze. Of course, women looked at that, and women were made to look at that as well. Right? And there's a whole debate about internalizing that gaze. But it was Foucault's work, not just Foucault, as I said, but Foucault's work that really released a lot of other work about this kind of gaze in different areas. I mean, in new studies arose, for example, in history. There was the Edward Said's work on in a book called Orientalism, 1978, on the Orientalist gaze. I don't know whether he uses that phrase or not, but many people following his work picked it up. So what is the Orientalist gaze? When the West looks at and represents people from the East in a certain exoticist or demonized way. Usually, for example, in India, there are two ways to go with that. Either India is full of temples and dancing girls and exotic Bharatanatyam dancing and colorful, beautiful saris and so on, or it's the demonic, the dangerous Muslim or violent character or super lazy, despotic Orientalist figure. And Said's work is interesting. His argument can be, well, there's a strong version, right, and a weaker version. Both are there in Said, I think. One, that the West, with this gaze of representing and making knowledge about the peoples of the Orient, has created them like that, has made them, has completely created them. Or the weaker argument is that it has misrepresented them and exaggerated some aspects and missed others. So whatever, it's a gaze that sees the Orient in racist, colonialist, colonizing terms. And this continued in other fields, right? So the gaze that belongs to photography and film, but throughout the rest of the social fabric, it has its effects, was taken up in anthropology, for example, by Jonathan Urry. He wrote a book called The Tourist Gaze. And it was a way of thinking about tourism as going around the world and staring at people. What someone said about my first book, actually, that all I'd done is gone to Calcutta and stared at people and wrote a book about them. And they're right. That the tourist goes and their gaze on a beautiful beach, on a market, on a temple, some historic site or something, is kind of consuming objectification of that world. And that world is turned into something for tourism to consume. And my teacher, Malcolm Crick, passed away 15 years ago now, but still, much missed. He wrote a fantastic essay about this called Sun, Sex, Side Savings and Civility, Representations of International Tourism in the Social Sciences, where he examined how the idea of the world was turned into a commodity to be stared at and consumed by tourists, whether it be sun or sights or exotic others, fantastic beautiful sunsets or people or temples. They became objects of consumption, and the idea was to get them cheap and to also live a luxurious life while you're consuming those things. So have nice, like, be photographing beautiful sunsets and lovely young maidens dressed with flowers around their necks and in their hair while sitting at the beach while a 10-year-old boy serves you lunch, because they didn't look at the economy of the tourism industry, where so much labor is exercised in order to produce the mass tourism experience, as if it was some kind of Robinson Crusoe ideal or something. All right, many studies look at the disconnect, the disjunct between photographs of beautiful beaches and the pollution that tourism leaves, or the way in which whole towns have been turned into sites for hordes of I don't know, foreign wealthy pleasure seekers to come and enjoy the luxuries of consuming these manicured sites, while cheap labor serves them pina coladas and lovely drinks, which is kind of terrible. But it is, when you think about how commodification operates in tourism, it does lead to some big questions about pollution. The same as if you think about commodification in the film industry of women or of sexuality. This concept of the gaze is very powerful, because it makes you examine the processes that are turning reality into commodities. It makes that that economic dimension very explicit. And it breaks it down so that you can, well, when it gets broken down even more, we do have to wonder dialectically if that doesn't dissuade us from having a stronger critique of the gaze. But we also need to understand how the gaze works in different particular areas, how the male gaze, how the tourist gaze, how the Orientalist gaze, and what other gazes, what other ways of seeing operative could we talk about? The way in which animals are stared at by and consumed by people who go on photo safaris. I mean, there are still people who go on shooting safaris, so they're consuming animals and killing them in a different way. But the photo safari is somehow a reflection of that. And it's, when you think about that, going and taking photos of cute animals, whether it be Richard Attenborough and the Wild Kingdom kind of, and Adorno, for example, loved that show, Animal Kingdom. Whether it's going out and finding this Richard Attenborough's fantastic film crew who gets shots of animals doing things that we'd never had photographs of them doing before, right through to Facebook and its pictures of cats doing cute or silly things. All of it is gazing on animals from a very privileged human point of view that is unrelated to it's not often related to the place of animals in our global culture, which is as meat largely, becoming extinct largely, or treated as this infantile appendages. You keep a dog now in your bag. Actually, they've just introduced a law in the New York subway. You're not allowed to take your pet on the subway unless that pet can fit into a bag, right? And there are fantastic photos of people putting huge dogs inside backpacks and so on. But the idea is actually legitimizing that kind of disgusting concept of putting an animal, a living animal, inside your handbag as it's like an accessory, along with your mobile phone and your lipstick and your hand sanitizer and all the other possessions that you own. And the idea that we possess animals as commodities like we do tissues, disposable and just used to pamper ourselves, is created in part by this ideology of the gaze. We like to look at cute, or we like to look at animals doing their thing in the wild, or we like to see what no one's seen before. Although I suppose there's some aspects of animal life that we just never want to see. The mass slaughter of cattle in the abattoir and so on. Okay, so then when we look at this gaze, when we start to think about what's involved in examining the gaze, we're forced to look at the economics of it. Who gets to gaze and who supports that gazing is an economic difference and one of exploitation and colonialism often, or sexism, or internalized double consciousness sexism, so that women participate in the objectification of themselves on screen because our values have become such that everyone agrees that to be beautiful and glamorous is a good thing. And that fuels that machinery of consumption of the image of people. And representation of people has changed so that once representation was a description of the world, now representation changes the world to fit the descriptions we want. So that we're kind of, well and good if we could beautify the world to really fit our image of it. And that's one of humanity's great achievements. But representation isn't just that. I was going to talk about two different meanings of representation. It's easier in German. Gayatri Spivak points this out, and in fact, it's there in Marx already. There are two different ways of thinking about representation that's related to indexicality. One, that representation is pictorial, right? It's something that's there, or gives you an indication of something that's there. It's and it can be wrong, and it can be fabricated, and it can be disconnected from the index now, sure, and yet it's still a picture of, and that's Darstellung in German, so they have a different word for it, but it's still representation of what's there. And then there's a more parliamentary or allegedly democratic, but hardly ever, version where you become the representative in the parliament of some others. And or you could be representing the interests of something that's not represented in a discursive space, like, I don't know, the United Nations, or in a classroom or something. And there it's vertreten, to stand as the representative of a group or a class or a set of beings. Now, these two versions of representation can overlap, and they do when the representative of our parliamentary systems or governing systems is photographed. Right? There's the photo of the president, who is our representative. Yay, all bow down. Or here is even a representation of some animals that are becoming extinct, and we need to have them represented in the court of appeal of public discourse. Right? So sometimes these two different kinds of representation can coexist. But they can be usefully thought of as very different things, since the representation of the world, as in its representation, has been manipulated and broken by new technologies that no longer rely on exact indexicality, so that what is in the photograph isn't exactly what was in the real. And in fact, the change in that indexicality can also be seen to happen in the representative systems in democracy, especially in democratic systems. You'll find that the representative is disconnected from the people he or she represents very often because of the intervention of another digital thing, big money that lobby that representative to vote a certain way, unconnected to the interests of the people that elected or put them there. So it's interesting to think of how there's a parallel or a semblance happening between the break of indexicality and picturing, representing, and the break of indexicality or break of representatives who then become opportunists and follow their own interests rather than the interests of the people that put them in place. Now, examining these nuances of the gaze may or may not bring us to this kind of critique, and it may overwhelm some other things that are going on with the photograph or with film or with representation in the pictorial sense. Like, it might be that we have talked ourselves into a focus on the gaze that then excludes some other things. So this came up even at the time when even more nuanced unpacking of what is involved in the gaze was going on. And the thinker I have in mind here is Laura Mulvey. I didn't put any of her reading up to read, but you can find it pretty easily. She's very interesting. Laura Mulvey is a British scholar. She was at Birkbeck for a long, long time, writing about film. And she developed a very perceptive way of examining photographs that allows us to look, to read, to learn to read photographs. All right, and that, I think there's some value in thinking through this. She, first of all, offers 3 levels of look. And I've asked for 5. I think there are 5, but you know, what is the schema that Laura Mulvey puts out? I mean, she was writing in the 70s and 80s. Well, she's still writing now, but she was really very prominent in the 70s, writing for magazines like Screen and for feminist magazines, and writing about the male gaze largely. Right? But her general thing on cinema and photography was to think of the camera as something that organizes the gaze. And there are these 3 different looks that she picks up on. That the camera records the pro-filmic event, that the audience watches the final product, and then the characters look at each other within the screen illusion. Let's look at that in detail. I rushed over that. I'm sorry. Okay. So again, the camera records the pro-filmic event. So one of the looks is, and she's talking largely about cinema, but it applies for photography. The camera looks at the people. Or the camera looks at the people. And that means, well, the photographer looks through the viewfinder. We don't have viewfinders anymore, right? Because it's digitized. But used to look through the, if we watch a little bit of Blow Up, you'll see that looking through, getting his body into very funny positions to take that photo, to get the framing right. Whereas now we just move the camera around, this kind of camera around, so we get the shot we like. But previously you had to squint and look through one eye, right? So or with one of these box brownie cameras, the lens was very different. You had to hold them like this because it was at a mirrored angle, and work very hard to get the right. So even so, to see what it is that you could see through the box brownie. But that brings us into thinking that the photographer looks at the image. The pro-filmic is that which is in front of the film, right? So the camera can pan, can change your angle, but you can't show what's behind the camera unless you get another camera and show a reflection, or a mirror and a reflection. But conceivably, right? The second kind of look is that the audience looks at the final product. So photographs are taken, they are printed, put in the bath of, the negatives are processed, then they're put in the bath of processing solution, and then the photographic paper, having been exposed to the negative, to light through the negative, has a positive image which you then hang up and dry, and you can see. And this process then produces a material artifact, the photograph, which you can then bore your friends to death with by showing your holiday snaps. Or you can, if you're a famous photographer, put in a gallery and people come and stand. And whether it be looking at snaps to hand, like this, or looking on a wall, there is a look between a consumer, a viewer, and the photograph, right? And unlike how with cameras with the viewfinder, and there are some still, yes, I agree. But unlike the contortions that the viewfinder made, we stand in front of the photograph and it's pretty flat. It's a flat world. I mean, yeah, you can look at an angle, but it doesn't change the picture very much, although the eyes seem to follow you. If you get the photo right, the eyes will follow you no matter where you move. So move like this, and Annabelle's eyes will follow you. All right, that's, where was that taken? In Dalat, I think. Yeah, near the waterfalls in Dalat. Just to consume tourism commodity. Okay, so that's the second look. But then there's also in a filmic event, the moment where the characters look at each other on the screen, and shot counter shot may interrupt this a little bit, but she's talking about, Laura Mulvey is talking about, within the screen illusion, within the acting or within the setup of the photograph, there can be an internal gaze, right? Classic example of this might be the famous scene of Marilyn Monroe over the subway in New York, where her dress is billowing up, and the guy who that film is largely about, following him, is watching her and saying, "Is that pleasurable for you?" When really we know it's pleasurable for him. So within the film, we're watching the male gaze consume the Marilyn Monroe commodity. Marilyn Monroe herself was somewhat aware of this. She says, that's the trouble with being a sex object. You're always an object. You never get to have the sex, although she probably did. And she doesn't want to be a commodity. She was very well read, and that side of her is only slowly coming out. Okay, they're the three looks that Mulvey talked about in a very famous, important essay, but other people have added to these looks, right? So one is that a character will look out of the frame, especially in film. They'll break the fourth wall and speak to the audience. But even in a photograph, you see something in the look. I don't know, let me show you another one of Annabelle just to exploit her all the more, or the two kids. They know damn well that they're being photographed, right? They're putting on a face for the photograph, or even this one as well. That's problematic as well, because she is like posing in this kind of consume. But when the illusion of this is just everyday life, right, is broken, we've got another kind of look going on where the person being photographed is looking at the photographer, but knows they're looking actually not at the photographer. They know they're looking at the audience of the photo. They're looking at the viewer, which is really interesting, because that's a future viewer. It's all future viewers, in fact. When you and that's what's happening when you take your selfie. Usually, you're looking at the camera, looking at yourself, but you're looking at yourself, thinking about how other people will see how you look. So this is a kind of doubled, even tripled look. You're looking at yourself, composing yourself for other people to look at. Because you take a selfie for yourself, but you sort of take it for other people. But you take it for yourself, really. You take it for your self-image of what you think other people might like, what you'd like other people to think you look like. Right? Not how you really are, because otherwise the photo would be of you, you know, picking your nose or doing all these horrible other things that all humans do. But we compose ourselves in front of the selfie with other people's image of ourselves, with what we want other people to see of ourselves in mind. Nicely complicated. And made even more complicated when more people get in on the selfie, right? A selfie of a whole crowd of people. You want to be the one in the crowd that's in the front of the selfie, or doing something funny in the background, right? To photobomb the selfie. And so there are these other looks inside the photographic, inside the pro-filmic space. See how we can talk about the way in which these looks operate and turn us into ourselves into commodities. And then in the scene of, right, think of a photographer, a famous photographer gets to put their photographs on the wall in an exhibition. Several people come and look at the photographs in the same way that you do in the gallery with paintings as well, or in the cinema with films. And then the viewer can look at the other viewer. Let's say this is another viewer. This hand is like a face, right? In my selfie, it's supposed to be. Huh? And look, And they can exchange a glance, a look saying, this photo's bad. A look that says, I don't understand what's going on. A look that says, oh, sexy, yeah. Some kind of meaningful glance, some kind of meaningful exchange, and that can elaborate into a much more commentary. And actually, essays on photography are that look, right? An essay on photography is the author of the essay talking to, looking at, talking to, talking with another possible viewer. Even if you haven't seen the photographs that they're talking about, you're a possible viewer. So there are other looks. I guess we can probably think of more. And that's my challenge for you for the questions. Can you think of more than these 5 looks, right? The camera looking, or the photographer looking at the event, the audience looking at the photograph. They're not looking at the event, they're looking at the second or the sequence that was chosen to be photographed. The characters looking at each other in the screen, the characters looking out of the screen at the viewer, and then the viewers looking at each other. Can we think of any more? I mean, there's an infinite reflection, receding echo of viewers looking at viewers, because right now we're looking at those viewers looking at each other, and then somebody could look at us looking at those viewers looking at each other, who could be looked at by etc ad infinitum. But that's not so interesting. There is another possible look that I can think of. Wow, I wonder if I can find a photo that would show it. And then insert it into the that's what I really can't easily do. I can't take an image from my search. But there's a film called Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock. And yeah, here it is. I'm going to share this screen because you can see it. It's got quite a lot of the things we're talking about. Hang on. So this is like Rear Window. You see the photographs of Rear Window here by Alfred Hitchcock. In 1954, he made this film. And let's see, which one will we take? Well, first of all, the story is that there's this guy in a wheelchair, right? And he lives in an apartment block, right? This is his apartment block, this big one here. Can you see that? Let me see, yeah, all right. You don't actually see my mouse moving around, do you? But the photograph that I've made bigger is his apartment block, right? And then he's in a wheelchair, all right? So he's stuck there looking out the window, and he spends his time with this huge telephoto lens staring at people doing stuff, right? He's got binoculars, first of all, but then he's got a camera, right? And it's James Stewart, the Jimmy Stewart, the actor. It's fantastic in this role. I mean, he's in a wheelchair the whole of the film, and all he's doing is staring out the back window of his apartment block, right? Framing these shots, but seeing into people's houses and into people's lives. It's like an ethnography. It's like a sociological study. At the same time, the film sets up other looks. So here's Jimmy Stewart looking at his friend who he said, look at what this is. They're investigating some woman in the apartment block across. He's got his friend to come over and look through the binoculars as well. And then he has some other friends come and look, right? While he's looking through his telephoto lens, they're also looking in the same direction as he describes them. But then he has like a relationship with his neighbor and so on, who of course is portrayed sometimes in the classic male gaze kind of pose. Right here's the male gaze looking at the woman who's portrayed for the camera, not for him. Right? See the angle in which she's portrayed at. She's allegedly, right, we assume she's looking out the window. But she's not really because of where the window is, but nonetheless, but she's posed for the camera where we are, for the viewer. But he's looking at her looking. So looking at someone looking, or looking at someone who's looking in a pornographic way. And in this one, look at his eyes. I wonder if I can make that bigger for you. Not really. He's not even looking the way his camera's looking, and she's looking quite terrified. This whole film is done, this whole series of obsession about looks. And of course, people are then photoshopped images onto the end of his camera as well. Let me see if I can get that up. Right, they put images on the lens, but it doesn't have it. Alamy, not even in focus. Good grief. See, I'm now down into the Alamy shots, and they're all rubbish. Let me go back. This is a publicity still for the film, which is an interesting one as well, because they're facing the window, but they're not looking at the window in this sequence. But we do see that he's obsessed with photography as well. Look at the photos on the wall. Anyway, I'd recommend you watch this Rear Window. Here's the still. The advertisement. Grace Kelly is the woman. The advertisement for the film shows the voyeuristic scene of some lovers, or are they having a fight or something, and then someone dancing, half-dressed. Other versions show him not looking at the apartment block, but nonetheless, he's looking, and there she is. Others focused on the binoculars. Right, didn't really give you an indication of what it was going to be about. Others the camera, but the camera has Hitchcock in the frame himself, a little cameo. But the camera is in the point of where her, like he's got his hands effectively where her bosom would be. I don't know whether that's significant. La fenestra sul côté, Spanish version. Fenêtre sur corps, French version. Let's see if we can find a sculpture. This is Danish, Swedish. Anyway, so this was the look. Let me show you a little bit of blow up. The film blew up by the famous director Antonioni. It's truly amazing. But very difficult to condense. So what I'm going to show you is just the difficulty of or the sexuality of the photographic scene as it's set up in this film. Let me turn the sound off and share this tab. How do I turn the sound off on here? Okay. So this guy is a photographer, right? And he works in a photographic studio. I'm taking the sound off, so I'm going to do the commentary myself. He's just handing out things. In the background, we see a couple of models preparing. And he's going to do this shoot. He's just got up. Maybe he had a hangover or not. And now this model that's there reflected. We first see her reflected, the famous model, who's only available for a short amount of time, is there. And he's gone rushing in, got up in the morning, and then he's casually getting a drink, which he doesn't drink. And then talks to her about how long you've been waiting. She's been waiting for ages, but she's got to go. Maybe I can put subtitles on this for you. Let me see. No. Doesn't allow a subtitle. Okay, anyway, they're going to photograph, right? And we'll see him doing his work as a photographer and how aggressive to get the best out of his model, he has to fabricate a situation. He's looking at her, he's consuming her like as if he was the camera. And this is for fashion photography, right? This is going to go all over the world on the front page of a magazine like Elle or, I don't know, Paris Match or what have you. And he's like the auteur, the artist now. She, of course, is the one that makes the image. Look, and her pose is something else. But he's the one who's directing her and the artist, and he makes the image and decides what will be the picture. The picture we're seeing is not what he's seeing. We're seeing this different image, which is equally made by our director, Antonioni, with this strange bunch of feathers projected. Look how rough our character is. Now he's sneaking up on the near naked girl. His assistant changes his tools. He's undone his shirt. A frenzied clicking, right? If you could hear the soundtrack, but we'll get feedback. He's getting closer and closer, almost like invading her space. He's telling her what to do. No, like this, like that. Wipe your face with your hand. Put your hand on your face again. More, yeah, that's beautiful. More. Right? He's seducing her with the camera. It's almost, well, it is pornographic. Photographic and pornographic at the same time. In order to get that shot, that one shot that will be on the cover. And she knows how to seduce the camera as well, right? She has the moves. They're sharing their creativity of this. I mean, and we as the audience, remember our gaze, we feel a little bit like uncomfortable watching this because it's like watching people make love. And in fact, his takes on this dominant sexual attitude and she takes on the submissive in order to get a good photo. Should I cut it now? Will I cut it now yet? No. Of course. He's trying to get that photo. He's only trying to get that photo. Lift up your head. Lift up your head. Come on. You see how he's contorting his body? And then he's got the photo. And no climax, nothing. She's left. He's exhausted, she's exhausted, but nothing happened. Possibly one of the sexiest scenes in cinema, I don't know. I'm not really inclined that way. He gets a phone call, he's got to go to another job. They're waiting for him in another room for the next set for photographing another fashion shoot. And he's got to go to another room, but he's exhausted and tired after an exertion. And she's got to rush off to Paris to be at another show as well, right? Anyway, then he gets cleaned up. I wonder if he's still in this is an apartment inside the studio. So he's had a time for a shave. He's looking at some contact prints. It's called contact prints, where we used to make very small versions of the negatives, just lay them out on paper and expose them to light. So you get an idea of what the image was without having to squint at the negative. You see this house where we really have no idea how big this place is. It's just full of stuff and photographs everywhere, and then it seems to move from one studio to another. There's some dancing going on up there. Obviously, they're photographing again, and the models see him. He's the star photographer, right? They know he's coming up to photograph them. The sign in the film is whenever he takes his shoes off, he's going to do photography. It's kind of some kind of like, it's not nothing's made of it in the film, but it's very curious. He's always taking his shoes off to go into these special environments that they've created to photograph. Here are the models who want to succeed. I might put the sound on now so you can hear this bit, because that's part of the story. So I'll shut up. Which means I turn my
stripes, let the dress just fall down. Absolutely full. Keep the stripes straight. It's very important. Just let the arms go up and down. Yes, very tasty. Yes, I like it. I like it. Go on. Yeah. All right, change position. Yep. Wake up! Now you can thank your lucky stars you're working with me, can't you? Right, one more.
Okay, so he says, thank you, lucky stars, you're working with me. And there he's getting the shot now. He's finally worked out how it's going to lay out. It's how these kind of things have nothing to do with reality, right? Of course, it's fashion shoots and so on. Throughout the film, there's then a whole sequence where, I won't give it away, but there's a fantastic sequence where the whole film is about him discovering something in a park, okay, and photographing it, and then having to develop it. Yeah, so he's developing ever more detailed versions of this photograph in order to see what he'd seen. Right? He's trying to work out what went on. He doesn't understand it, and he's using photography as a kind of research tool. And blow up. The idea of the film Blow Up is to blow up this pro-filmic event and look at what's being looked at. And here the thing is that he's discovered that inside the film, this woman is photographed. Let me see if we can get her. And the man, see if I can get her. Come on. She's see in this photograph, she's looking at something inside the pro-filmic, and he's trying to work out what it is that she's looking at that seems to have got her so afraid. And that's why it's fantastic, this film, because she's in this embrace in a park with a man, but what's she looking at? And he tries to work out where she is, what she'll be looking at, and then he expands this area here. And it's awesome. Anyway, enough. That's called Blow Up, and you should watch it if you can. It's full film is on YouTube. It's an Italian. It's in English, but it's an Italian edition. That's the full film. You don't always get. The chance to subtitle it, but Laura Mulvey's film looks are all there, including us looking at a film. We would include in the 5. But I want to move on to another person who seems to have taken Laura Mulvey's thunder in a way, her long reign in visual studies, and that's the Israeli-born Algerian descent scholar Ariella Aisha Azule. She seems to have added the name Aisha as she became more famous in the West. And her book was what we read, okay? Her work's really impressive. And in the chapter we read, she sets out a schema that's not unlike Laura Mulvey's looks, but actually she is understanding the photographic scene, right? And who it looks at the people involved. So she's very pro-Palestinian in her writing and activism, and and elsewhere in the world. So she's looking at what she calls the protagonists of the photographic event. And who are the protagonists? There is a camera. There's the camera acts. The technology shapes what kind of image can be made, right? And increasingly it makes ease of image making, whereas before there was a machine that had to be very carefully calibrated. Now we don't even have to think about the calibration. Somebody else has done that thinking for us. There's whoever stands behind the lens, all right, the photographer, whoever faces the lens, the people photographed, and whoever may become a spectator, right? And she points out that the person standing in front of the lens, the photographer, is usually designated as having made the shot. So the famous, in Antonioni's Blow Up, the guy in the blue shirt is the star. But it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because the person making the shot in that fashion shoot was also the woman who's absorbed, sure, the male gaze and presents herself as a sex kitten object, but she is making the shot as well. But because we also want to consume those images, the demand, the customer, the viewer demand for images is authoring the shot as well, as is the camera company. So all of the four figures in her schema are protagonists, right? And even more so, there are other protagonists, right? So in Blow Up, the guy, I think his name's Richard, is trying to photograph, and one of the questions is he allowed to photograph that scene in the park? Does he have permission? What a photographer is permitted to shoot is important. In Azulay's case, she was writing about the Israeli occupation of Palestine and expelling some refugees, killing many, and having them buried and uncovering the graves to check. And the photographer was allowed to photograph some things, but not getting too close, not getting too detailed. So the state can be an actor, can be a protagonist in allowing certain things to be photographed and certain things not to be photographed. And you can imagine many, many examples where that's true. And then the viewer can also be swayed in interpreting what is in the photograph, but by what they see underneath the photograph, the caption, or what they hear someone say about the photograph that might encourage a certain interpretation or exclude another interpretation. Like, so the thing is, photographs can be evidence of the real, but they can also mislead you from the real. And we can think of many examples of this. Right? Cases where photographs have been used as evidence and then have been turned around and used as evidence in a different way for the other side, right? Especially in court. Lawyers are super good at this kind of twisting political perspective. And of course, history is written by the victors and so on. Azoulay's essay, and I don't want to move on without mentioning this, really focuses on a rape case. And so its sexual dimension is to be read, and it's horrible and difficult, and I don't want to skip over it, but I also don't want to say much about that except to read it and recognize what a violent, catastrophic consequence of the male gaze in war rape becomes, and how dominant it is. And she exposes that. What I'm taking out of this, though, is her other point about how focus, what's included in the frame and what's not, can be political. And what you're allowed to see by the state or by the mainstream media or whatever is also going to influence your interpretation. I mean, this part of it is well known. That's why the section on rape is so important, because she's really doing something profound there. But the other aspect is also important, but many people have also already said that. Manufacturing consent by Noam Chomsky, for example, with this famous image shows how a certain look of the media can show the opposite, right? And if we start to look at looks or look at the protagonists in the event, we can start to question a lot of things. This can be in history. So here's a photograph by Felice Bieto of the 2,000 Europeans that were killed in Lucknow in what Marx calls the First All India Rebellion, what the British call the Mutiny, in Lucknow. And this is a photograph of, look, the bones of the dead spread out in in front of the old Secundabaga building of the Raj. You look now. This photograph is a real photograph. Like, there's no manipulation of the actual photograph here, but there is manipulation of history and the truth, because when the camera person, Felice Beato, French camera person, got to Lucknow to take this photograph, it was months and months after the killing. And these bones were not just laid out on the forecourt of the building just like this. They were in a storage room, and they were brought out and arranged so the photograph could be taken. All right. So the pro-filmic that we see, that is a sepia-colored evidence photo, is not evidence at all. I mean, why? Think about this. Why would these guys just be sitting around in a field that was so macabre, that had these skeletal bodies and skulls? You have to ask the question, why are they there? What are they looking at? What are we looking at? And it turns out we are looking at an image that was it's now on the British Library website, right? It's digital version, and is taken as a historical photograph, but it's not. It's a fabricated part of history as written by the victors, right? The Indian Rebellion failed to get rid of the British at that point in 1857-58, and there was a massive repression of the Indians who, because they did kill. I'm not saying that 2,000 British weren't killed, but the ideological or the framing of the history afterwards to justify the even more people that were killed to put down the rebellion is supported by this fictional photograph, this historical photograph. So looking at the gaze, looking at the protagonist helps us think about this. Who's looking at this? Why are we looking at it? Who's letting us see this? What are we allowed to see? What are we not allowed to see? We don't see that all these bones have been cleared up. Think about that in more recent history. If we look at this famous photograph, does anyone know where it is? Is this photograph famous for you guys? Anyone?
The Osama bin Laden assassination.
Yeah, right. So in this day and age, with, as we know, every soldier in SEAL Team 6 that went into Abbottabad in the helicopters on this day to get allegedly Osama bin Laden, they've all got head cameras on their helmets, and they've got a live feed into the sit room in the White House where Obama, current President Biden, the chief of staff, various supporters, the general, Hillary Clinton, are watching live footage from the head cams of the SEAL Team 6 commandos that capture and kill Osama bin Laden. But this was the photograph that was released by the White House as a publicity shot to celebrate USA, right? That moment where America finally, after 10 years, kill Osama bin Laden. No photographs of Osama bin Laden. We don't see the scene. We don't even see the protagonist. We don't even see the screen. What we see is the consumption of the look. And they're all looking at the screen except for this one guy who's controlling his screen via his laptop. Only Hillary Clinton is feigning some shock or concern. Everybody else is interested with grim determination, right? But they released this photograph. No moving footage, of course, we must have film of them in the Situation Room. If they took this photograph as a publicity photograph, they've got film. That room must be filmed for the historical record, right? Surely, after Nixon recorded all of his tapes on a tape recorder inside the presidential desk, and that's what got him forced to resign, impeached after all. So also we must have moving footage. We must have the video of the event. They didn't just like erase the video after the live stream from SEAL Team 6. And SEAL Team 6 took photographs both of Osama bin Laden's dead body. There were actually one or two that circulated on the internet, but hard to find now. And of his body on the ship where they took him out to sea and threw him overboard. Oh, buried at sea. Right, so there would be no grave for the martyrs to come and look at, worship at, or so on. Right? This is an amazing photograph. I mean, if you think of framing of photographs, it's pretty well framed in terms of the rule of thirds. Okay, if you focus in on Hillary, she is the core image in the photograph because it should work in a spiral. Oh, I've run out of time really to talk about this. We're going to have to stop. But I talk about this photograph in my book, Global South Asia on Screen, because this is a moment of South Asian history in Pakistan. And it's bizarre that they went for a still, silent, no commentary. But yet it says much. Look at Hillary. She's got on her lap a notebook, some other documents. She's got in front of her some maps she's obviously been given to look at, which is an aerial shot of the compound in Abbottabad. I don't know how to say it. Interesting. So yeah, I think it's a similar photograph to this one in so many ways. There's been, I mean, what are they watching? They're watching an execution movie, a snuff movie. Only Hillary seems shocked at that. The one woman, well, there's two women in the room, but only Hillary seems shocked, and Hillary is the one person I think that has no heart. But that's by the by, because of her other involvement in wars with Bill, and but they are all watching someone snuff it, a snuff film in the White House, and this was celebrated. It's really such a potent political scene. Anyway, I'm going to stop so we can have a break, make a cup of tea, and so on and so forth, and get back for discussion. Let me end the recording.